Every Sunday morning, before the world fully woke, a man named David walked through the iron gates of Oakwood Cemetery with the same quiet ritual. His footsteps fell on wet grass, his shoulders carried the weight of 15 years, and his hands trembled, as they always did when he knelt before a small granite stone carved with the name of his daughter. He never spoke. He never stayed long. He simply came, knelt in silence, and let the tears fall like rain on marble, the only language grief knew how to speak. No one saw him, or so he thought. Hidden behind the old oak trees that lined the cemetery's eastern path, a teenager named Marcus watched. Marcus came to the cemetery for different reasons. He came to disappear. Abandoned by a mother he barely remembered, shuffled between foster homes, and rejected by a world that saw him as broken, the cemetery was the only place where his absence didn't feel like a disappointment. Between the graves of the forgotten dead, Marcus felt less alone. But then he noticed David. And something in the way that man cried, something in the way his whole body shook with love for someone gone, awakened something in Marcus he thought had died long ago. The capacity to care about someone other than himself. What neither of them knew was that their two solitudes were about to become a bridge. A small act of witnessing would transform both their lives, teaching them that sometimes healing doesn't come from forgetting the dead, but from recognizing the living who stand beside us in the dark. This is the story of how a broken man and a broken boy learned to mend each other through silence, through presence, and through the quiet heroism of simply showing up when no one else would. Chapter 1. The Weight of Sundays. David arrived at the cemetery at 6:47 a.m., as he always did on Sundays. The sky was still bruised with early morning grey, and mist clung to the headstones like breath. He'd done this for 15 years, every Sunday without fail. Rain or snow, illness or exhaustion, David came. It was the only promise he still kept. He parked his truck at the far end of the lot and sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, gathering the strength it took to face the day. Beside him on the passenger seat lay a small bundle of lilies, white and perfect, the kind his daughter Emma had loved to pick from their garden when she was 7 years old. She was 11 when the fever came. She was 12 when she stopped breathing. The path to her grave ran past the old sections of the cemetery, where stones dated back 100 years or more. David had walked it so many times that his feet knew every crack, every root, every slight incline. His legs moved on memory while his mind stayed somewhere else. Somewhere frozen in the afternoon she died, in the hospital room where he held her hand for the last time. The morning air was cold. David's breath came in small clouds, and his fingers had begun to stiffen by the time he reached the grave. He knelt slowly, the way an old man kneels, though he was only 51. Grief had aged him in ways that years never could. "Hi, sweetheart," he whispered, placing the lilies against the stone. His voice cracked on the second word. It always did. He traced her name with his finger. Emma Sarah Chen, beloved daughter, 1996-2008. 15 years had passed, but the numbers still felt new, still felt wrong. He should have been watching her graduate from high school. He should have walked her down an aisle. He should have held grandchildren in his arms. Instead, he held lilies. The tears came like they always did, silent and heavy. David didn't try to stop them. This was his 1 hour of the week where he allowed himself to break completely. At work, he was steady. At home, in his empty house, he was functional. But here, in front of this stone, he was permitted to shatter. He stayed until the mist began to lift and the sun broke through the clouds in pale gold lines. Then, as always, he wiped his face with his sleeve, placed his hand on the stone one final time and whispered, "I miss you, baby. I'll see you next week." Behind the distant oak trees hidden in shadow, Marcus watched the entire ritual. The teenager sat cross-legged on an old stone bench, his dark eyes tracking every movement of the grieving man. Marcus had seen him before, many times, but today something felt different. Today, Marcus understood, because Marcus had also lost someone, not to death but to abandonment. His mother had left him at a hospital when he was 3 days old, and no one had ever bothered to tell him why. Sometimes he wondered if she was still alive, somewhere in this world, if she ever thought of him the way this man clearly thought of his daughter. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt connected to another human being. Chapter 2. The Watcher in Shadow. Marcus had been living in the woods behind Oakwood Cemetery for 3 months. His last foster family had kicked him out after he was arrested for shoplifting, a misdemeanor he committed not out of hunger, but out of a desperate need to feel something, anything, even if it was fear. The cemetery, with its quiet graves and its monuments to loss, had become his sanctuary. No one bothered him here. The groundskeepers left him alone, or perhaps they simply didn't notice him. Marcus had become expert at disappearing. He was 16 years old and felt like he'd lived 100 years already. He was tall and lean, all sharp angles and hollow eyes, with the kind of face that made people uncomfortable. Not because he was unattractive, but because his face carried the evidence of every disappointment he'd endured. It was the face of someone who had learned that the world did not want him in it. That Sunday, after David left, Marcus made his way to a different part of the cemetery, to an unmarked grave that he'd discovered weeks earlier. There was no stone, just a small plaque, Infant John Doe, 1987. Marcus didn't know who had been buried there, didn't know the story behind the simple plaque, but there was something about the anonymity that called to him. The idea that someone had been born into this world and then immediately forgotten. He sat beside the grave and drew. Drawing was the only thing Marcus knew how to do well. His art teacher, before the system had shuffled him away from her classroom, had told him he had real talent. "You see things," she'd said, "that most people miss. Your pencil finds the truth in small moments." Marcus held on to that memory like it was a life raft. Today he sketched the image of the man kneeling at the grave, the way his shoulders curved inward like a question mark, the shape of his grief rendered in graphite and shadow. Marcus drew the lilies, the headstone, the terrible beauty of someone allowed to break openly in front of the dead. He didn't know why he was drawing this man. He only knew that something about witnessing David's pain had cracked something open inside his own chest, and the only way to make sense of it was to put it on paper. By the time the sun had fully risen, Marcus had filled an entire page with the image. It was good work, some of his best. The grief was visible in every line. The love was visible too, even in the way the man's hands were positioned, even in the vulnerable curve of his spine. Marcus tore the page from his sketchbook and held it for a long moment, watching the wind almost take it from his fingers. Then carefully he folded it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He didn't know what he was going to do with it yet. He only knew that he couldn't destroy it, and he couldn't throw it away. This image, this moment, this stranger's grief, belonged to him now too. Chapter 3. The Offering. The next Sunday came cold and grey. Rain had been falling since Saturday night, and the cemetery paths were slick with wet leaves. David almost didn't come. The arthritis in his knees ached, and his heart felt particularly heavy. 15 years, and some Sundays felt like they were the first ones, like the loss was fresh and impossible all over again. But he came anyway. He always came. He was kneeling at Emma's grave, lilies in hand, when he noticed something odd. Tucked carefully beneath a small stone at the base of her headstone was a piece of paper, folded in half and somehow protected from the rain by the angle of the stone itself. David's heart skipped. His first thought was that it was vandalism, some cruel message, some desecration of his daughter's grave. With shaking hands, he reached for it and opened it carefully. It was a drawing. The pencil work was extraordinary. detailed and precise, rendered in shades of grey that seemed to hold light within them. And it was a drawing of him, of David, kneeling at this very grave, his face turned downward, his whole body rendered as a study in sorrow. The artist had captured something that David didn't recognize in himself, beneath the grief. There was a kind of beauty in the surrender to it. There was dignity in the breaking. David stood up slowly, the drawing trembling in his hands, and looked around the cemetery. It was empty, just rows of stones and wet grass, and the soft percussion of rain. Whoever had left this was gone, but they had been here. They had seen him. He folded the drawing carefully and placed it inside his jacket, against his heart. For the first time in 15 years, David felt less alone in his grief. Someone had witnessed it. Someone had seen his pain and deemed it worthy of their attention, worthy of their art. The implications of this simple act rippled through him like waves. He stayed longer that day, much longer than he normally did. He sat on a nearby bench and looked at the drawing again and again, studying every line, every shadow, trying to understand who might have made it and why. CTA. Comment where you're watching from. These stories of kindness connect hearts across the world. Behind the oak trees, Marcus watched from a distance. He saw the moment David found the drawing. He saw the way the man's entire body seemed to soften, the way his hand went to his chest. Marcus saw the tears, yes, but he also saw something new in those tears. Not just sorrow, but recognition. The man knew he'd been seen, and somehow that knowledge seemed to change everything. Chapter 4. The Shift. For the first time in 3 months, Marcus slept through the entire night without nightmares. He woke beneath the makeshift shelter he'd constructed from fallen branches and plastic sheeting, tucked behind a row of old crypts, and felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It was fragile and strange, and he was almost afraid to name it. It felt like hope. He spent the next 6 days sketching. He filled page after page of his battered sketchbook with new drawings of the man and the grave, variations on the theme of grief and devotion. He drew the lilies in different stages of wilting. He drew the headstone from different angles. He drew the man's hands, the expression in his eyes, imagined from distance, but drawn with the intuition of someone who understood sorrow intimately. By the end of the week, Marcus had a collection of 10 drawings, each one an offering, each one a small prayer to a man he'd never spoken to. Meanwhile, David had undergone his own transformation. He'd placed the drawing in a frame and hung it in his home office, the one room where he'd kept most of Emma's photographs and mementos. Looking at it several times a day, he felt something shift in his grief. It wasn't that the pain lessened, rather the pain became a bridge instead of a wall. Someone else had looked at his sorrow and honored it. Someone else had borne witness. This simple fact seemed to change everything. David began keeping a journal, something he'd never done before. He wrote about Emma, not about her death, but about her life. He wrote about the way she laughed when he tickled her ribs. He wrote about her terrible singing voice and her perfect sense of humor. He wrote about how she'd wanted to be a marine biologist, how she used to drag him to the aquarium at least twice a month, how she'd press her small hands against the glass and whisper to the fish as if they could understand her. For 15 years, David had grieved the loss of his daughter's future, but now he began to celebrate the beauty of her past. And that celebration felt like a kind of healing. On the following Sunday, when he arrived at the cemetery, he found 5 new drawings placed carefully at the base of Emma's grave, each one protected from the rain by small stones. David collected them with reverent hands. He studied each one, seeing new details, new dimensions of his own grief rendered back to him by an unknown artist. And in studying these drawings, David realized that someone, some young person with remarkable talent, was as broken as he was. Someone else was carrying sorrow in a form he recognized. He decided in that moment that he needed to meet them. Chapter 5. The search for 2 weeks. David began arriving earlier on Sundays, hoping to catch the artist in the act of leaving the drawings. He sat on different benches, positioned himself at different angles around the cemetery, watching. But whoever was leaving the sketches was careful, methodical, and invisible. David was not a detective by nature, but he was motivated by something deeper than curiosity. He was motivated by gratitude and by the need to connect with another human being who understood the specific language of loss. He studied the drawings more carefully, looking for clues. The pencil work was professional grade, which suggested the artist had training or natural talent. The subject matter, grief, stones, the arrangement of flowers and markers, suggested someone who spent time in the cemetery. The age of the hand, the drawings were detailed but had a youthful energy to them, suggested someone young, possibly a teenager. David began to spend more time at the cemetery on weekdays. He'd bring a book and sit for hours, watching, waiting. The groundskeepers knew him by sight now and left him alone. Other visitors came and went, but none of them seemed to be leaving the drawings. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, when David had almost given up hope of finding his mysterious artist, he saw him. The boy appeared from between 2 rows of old crypts, moving quietly, almost furtively, like someone used to not being noticed. He was tall and thin, with dark hair and the kind of tired eyes that David recognized immediately, the eyes of someone who had learned that the world was not kind. The teenager made his way to Emma's grave and knelt down, looking around first to make sure he was alone. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a new drawing, placed it gently at the base of the headstone, and held it there for a moment with his hand over it, as if blessing it. David realized that if he revealed himself now, he would startle the boy. So instead, he watched. He watched as the teenager looked at the grave, read the inscription, and traced Emma's name with his finger, the same way David himself did, and in that moment David saw something in the boy that broke his heart. He saw the same need to connect with the dead, the same desperate hope that somehow, by honoring someone else's loss, he might heal his own. David waited until the boy had left. Then he picked up the drawing and saw, tucked beneath it, a small folded note. The note was written in a careful hand. I hope the drawings help. I hope someone missing someone sees them and knows they're not alone. I hope it helps to know that someone is watching your grief and thinks it's beautiful and true. I can't say more, but I wanted you to know. You're not the only one who mourns here. There was no signature, but it didn't matter. David understood everything now. The boy was as lost as David was, and by bearing witness to David's grief, the boy was learning to honor his own. Chapter 6. The silence between words. The following Sunday, David made a decision. Instead of taking the usual path to Emma's grave, he walked quietly toward the oak trees where he'd glimpsed the boy. He moved slowly, giving the teenager every chance to notice him and leave before their paths collided. But the boy didn't run. Marcus stood motionless as David approached, his whole body tense with the possibility of confrontation or rejection. David stopped a few feet away, giving the boy space. The drawings, David said softly. They're beautiful. Thank you for them. Marcus couldn't speak. His throat was dry, his heart was racing, and he was caught between the urge to run and the urge to finally let someone see him. I'm David, the man said, and he reached out his hand slowly, like he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt. Marcus, the boy managed, and his hand was cold when it met David's, but it was real, and it was there. They didn't say much more that day. David invited Marcus to sit with him at Emma's grave, and Marcus followed, moving like a ghost. like he wasn't quite sure he was actually present in his own life. They sat together in silence for a long time, and the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of understanding. When it was time to leave, David wrote his phone number on a piece of paper and left it at the grave. "Call me," he said, "if you want to or don't. But I want you to know that I see you too." CTA, if this story has already touched your heart, hit the like button. It helps the message of compassion reach more people who need hope. Marcus took the paper, and he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket, next to his heart. For the first time in his life, someone had seen him and not looked away. Someone had acknowledged his existence and deemed it worthwhile. That night, Marcus made a phone call. Chapter 7. The space between loss and hope. David's house wasn't much. A small, neat home, filled with the quiet of someone living alone. But when Marcus walked through the door that first evening, following David's invitation to come over for dinner, it felt like entering a sanctuary. The walls were covered with photographs, Emma at different ages, laughing, dreaming, living. There were drawings too, some of them Marcus's, now framed and honored, and there was a single room that David opened the door to, slowly, reverently. Emma's room. It hadn't been touched in 15 years. The bed was neatly made with a purple comforter. There were books on shelves, sketches tacked to walls. Emma had drawn too, David said quietly. Stuffed animals arranged on the windowsill. And on the wall above the desk hung a poster, the ocean photographed from above, all blues and greens and mystery. She wanted to be a marine biologist, David said, standing in the doorway, not quite entering. She loved the water, loved all living things. Marcus stood in the room and felt something crack open inside his chest, a place he'd kept locked and sealed since he was very small. He thought about his own mother, about the biological accident that had resulted in his existence, about the way he'd been discarded like he didn't matter. She was lucky, Marcus said finally, to have someone love her like that. David turned to look at him, and his eyes were full of tears. "She would have loved you," he said. Emma was kind. She understood loneliness. "I think she would have wanted to help you." Over the following weeks, Marcus began to spend more time at David's house. He continued to create, but now he was creating with purpose. David gave him a proper sketchbook, quality pencils, and an entire corner of the office to work in. Slowly, without talking about it much, Marcus began to replace the drawings of grief with drawings of other things. The sky, the birds that visited the cemetery, the way light fell through trees. And slowly David began to heal too. He talked more about Emma, not as a memory trapped in amber, but as a person he'd known and loved. He shared stories that made Marcus laugh. He showed Marcus photographs from happier times. He cried, yes, but the tears were different now. They were mixed with smiles, with the bittersweet joy of remembering rather than the devastating weight of forgetting. Together, they created a kind of ritual. Every Sunday, they still went to the cemetery. But now Marcus came with David. They left flowers and a new drawing together. And sometimes David would tell Emma about Marcus, speaking aloud to his daughter, as if she could hear. And sometimes Marcus would feel his own mother listening from wherever she was, and he would whisper thank you for leaving him on the steps of that hospital, because if she hadn't, he would never have met David. It was a strange kind of healing, built on loss and redemption, on witnessing and being witnessed. Chapter 8. The Revelation. 6 months after Marcus and David first spoke at the cemetery, social services caught up with him. A teacher had reported his absence from school, and the system had finally noticed the boy who'd been living in its cracks. Marcus was 17 now, and he was facing either prosecution for vagrancy or placement in another foster home. The court appearance was scheduled for a grey Thursday in March, and David sat in the gallery while a young social worker presented Marcus's case to a tired judge. The prognosis wasn't good. Marcus had a record: no family, no stable housing, and no clear path forward. The judge seemed prepared to offer another year in the system, another foster family, another temporary solution. Then David stood up. He'd been quiet throughout the hearing, but now he rose from his seat and requested to address the court. The judge, surprised, allowed it. "Your Honor," David said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I'd like to request permission to serve as a foster parent to Marcus. I have a stable home, permanent employment, and the ability to provide for him. More than that, I have space in my life and in my heart for this young man." The social worker looked shocked. The judge looked skeptical. But something in David's testimony, the quiet certainty of it, the depth of feeling beneath the formal words, seemed to resonate. Marcus, sitting at the defendant's table, felt tears streaming down his face. He didn't dare to hope. Hope had taught him nothing but disappointment. But he also didn't look away from David, and David didn't look away from him. The case was continued for a home study, but the judge's tone had shifted. There was a possibility now, a fragile thread of a different future. 3 months later, Marcus legally became part of David's household. The paperwork was finalized on a sunny Tuesday, and when they left the courthouse, David took Marcus's shoulder and squeezed it. "You're home," David said simply. Marcus didn't know how to respond to that. Home was a concept he'd never quite understood. But walking beside David through the parking lot, seeing the small house that was now his as they pulled into the driveway, Marcus thought he might finally be beginning to comprehend what that word meant. Chapter 9. The circle closes. 1 year later, David and Marcus returned to Oakwood Cemetery on a Sunday morning in spring. The grounds were alive with new growth. Flowers blooming, grass green and thick, birds singing in the trees. It was a day full of light and possibility, the kind of day that Emma might have loved. They carried not just lilies, but also a small stone plaque. It had taken them months to get it made. Months of working with the cemetery's administration, but finally permission had been granted. The plaque read, "Marcus Chen, beloved son, an artist, a witness, a bridge between worlds." It was placed beside Emma's grave, not as a burial stone, but as a monument to something the two of them had built together, a bridge that connected loss to hope, isolation to belonging, the unbearable weight of grief to the unexpected gift of healing. Marcus carried his sketchbook, as he always did now. His drawings had evolved. He was applying to art schools, colleges that might offer him scholarships based on his portfolio. David had encouraged him, had pushed him gently but insistently toward a future, toward believing that he deserved one. As they sat together at the graves, Marcus opened his sketchbook and showed David the drawing he'd completed that morning, a new piece. It was David and Marcus, sitting together in the cemetery, surrounded by flowers and light, rendered not as a tragedy, but as an act of grace. "It's for you," Marcus said quietly, "for the walls, for the house." David took the sketchbook and looked at the image for a long moment. And then he did something he hadn't done in front of Marcus since that first day at Emma's grave. He let himself cry. But these tears were different. They held gratitude. They held hope. They held the recognition that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is to be broken alongside them and to believe together in the possibility of healing. "Thank you," David whispered, "for coming back, for staying, for letting me be your father." Marcus leaned his head on David's shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time, two broken people made whole by the simple act of witnessing each other's pain and refusing to look away. Around them, the cemetery was full of the quiet voices of the dead, and full too of the living, breathing presence of two souls who had learned that love doesn't require blood. It requires only the willingness to show up week after week and hold space for another person's grief as if it were sacred. The light moved across the stones. The flowers bent in the gentle breeze, and in the space between sorrow and hope, between the living and the dead, something beautiful had been born. Epilogue. Years later, people would speak of the young man and the older man they saw at Oakwood Cemetery on Sunday mornings, and they would remember not the sadness, but the light that seemed to follow them. The evidence that sometimes kindness is the most radical act of resistance against a world that tries to break us apart.